All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for so much for being with us today. So first of all, I would request that if you could turn on your camera, that would be really helpful for us because we need a more humane interaction. So if you can turn on your camera, that would be really, really helpful for us. Obviously, it's not required, but we would appreciate if you could do that. So let me introduce myself very quickly. My name is Yasemin Ipek. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Global Affairs at Mason. I'm also teaching for the anthropology department as I'm an anthropologist by training. And one of our popular courses is Anthropology 308, which is the peoples and cultures of the Middle East. And I would like to thank to all of my students in this class for coming to this meeting today. So far, they have been doing an impressive job. And during such a global pandemic and other forms of crises, I appreciate their efforts. And we are meeting for our class session as part of the Fall 2020 Ali Vural Ak Center guest lecture series. So I want to thank to Ali Vural Ak Center and especially to the director, Dr. Peter Mendeville, and program coordinator, Ayşenur Sönmez. Thank you so much for coming up with this idea of collaborating with the professors for the public events. And I think it's a fantastic idea. We did meet with Professor Shirin Hamdi before, and now we have Dr. Darryl with us. This is so exciting. Also, I would like to request everyone, if you were not as part of the email list so far, please do follow the events of the Ali Vural Ak Center. It's a very vibrant community. I am so proud to be a part of it. The center is fostering, conducting research and scholarship to advance a nuanced, multidisciplinary understanding of Muslim societies and also educating the broad public about the dynamics that shape Muslim communities worldwide. So please see the chat box and messages coming from Ayşenur. We have several events upcoming this semester and of course, so many others in the next semester. And of course, I would like to introduce you our guest speaker today, Dr. Darryl Lee. Darryl Lee is an assistant professor of anthropology and associate member of the law school at the University of Chicago. He has kindly agreed to join us today to discuss his new book titled The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity. In a radical departure from conventional wisdom on the topic, the universal enemy argues that transnational jihadists are engaged in their own form of universalisms. These fighters struggle to realize an Islamist vision directed at all of humanity, transcending racial and cultural difference. Anthropologist and attorney Darryl Lee conceptualizes jihad as armed transnational solidarity under conditions of American empire, revisiting a pivotal moment after the Cold War when ethnic cleansing in the Balkans dominated global headlines. Muslim volunteers came from distant lands to fight in Bosnia-Herzegovina alongside their co-religionists, offering themselves as an alternative to the US-led international community. Lee highlights the parallels and overlaps between transnational jihads and other universalisms, such as the war on terror, United Nations peacekeeping, and socialist non-alignment. Developed from more than a decade of research with former fighters in a half dozen countries, the Universal Enemy explores the relationship between jihad and American empire to shed critical light on both. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Lee, and he is kindly offering us to have a brief presentation, given that not everyone in the audience might have read the book. So please welcome Dr. Lee.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for making the time to Zoom in for this. I personally find these events really challenging in terms of the attention grab. So I'm extra grateful for you to take time out of your day. Also, thank you to the Ak Center, to Yasemin, Ayşenur, and Peter for having me. It's really great to be here. And yeah, I think I'll just say a little bit about the book and we'll try to leave ample time for question and answer. So let me see if I can get this screen thing. Okay, you can see this, right? Yeah, okay, great. In fact, I can also turn off my video. So as Yasemin mentioned, this book, The Universal Enemy, draws from a decade and a half of research into the question of the so-called foreign Islamist fighter, right? So this is a figure of threat that has been widely discussed and debated and acted upon over the past quarter century or more. So in conflicts around the world, from places raging such as Afghanistan in the 1980s and onwards, to Kashmir, Chechnya, Philippines, Iraq, Syria, to more recent years, the figure of the so-called foreign fighter, foreign Islamist fighter in particular, has elicited particular notoriety and interest. And it's precisely because they combine piety, transnational mobility, and violence in a way that that seems to be radically outside of how we conventionally think of legitimate political violence, right? Which is namely, political violence is authorized by the nation state through citizen armies and similar institutions. So the foreign transnational Islamist fighter is seen to, reject all of these basic tenets of how violence and political violence is to be legitimized. And by extension, they're often seen as rejecting tolerance, multiculturalism, universalism, pretty much all forms of difference. So that's the figure that that's the subject of the book and has been widely discussed, but not subject to a ton of sort of, critical and rigorous research. So the idea behind the book is to better understand the world of these transnational jihad mobilizations. And I should be specific that the study really is transnational armed mobilizations in the name of jihad, which is not the same thing as every single action that is done in the name of jihad, right? So there's a question that we can get to maybe in the Q&A or discuss for later about what is the relationship between jihad as a category and kind of a more social scientific category of jihadism. Anyway, just putting that aside, the book is based primarily on a little bit more than a year of fieldwork that I conducted in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I'll say a little bit more about why Bosnia in a moment, mostly with Arab and Bosnian former combatants who participated in the war in the 1990s in Bosnia and participated in the name of jihad. I also managed to find veterans of the jihad in Bosnia in a bunch of other countries. Egypt, Pakistan, Malaysia, Yemen, Palestine, France, the US, the UK, a few other countries I'm probably forgetting at the moment, and was able to supplement these ethnographic life history interviews with a considerable archival record, internal documents, as well as publications. So these were in Arabic, in Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, in Urdu, French, Italian, English, of course, as well. Anyway, so as I mentioned, there are a number of these conflicts around the world where you have these kind of transnational jihad mobilizations sort of joining the scene. And the book focuses on the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina from 1992 to 1995 in particular. So for those who may not be familiar with the history, the war in Bosnia, as well as the broader kind of breakup of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was a communist state in Southeast Europe, this series of crises really dominated the agenda of the so-called international community in the 1990s. So you had a situation of multiple sort of ethno-nationalist conflicts and partitions. In the case of Bosnia, the population was plurality Muslim. Now today has a very, very slight Muslim majority. And the presence of a large and autochthonous European Muslim population was seen as anomalous and interesting in many parts of the world. So in terms of the West, the Bosnia crisis and the ex-Yugoslav crises in general elicited enormous interest in sort of projects of humanitarian intervention. So this is really the moment right after the Cold War where there's a new kind of world order emergent, and the United States in particular is trying to make sense of its own place in the world as a kind of global hegemon. And one of the rationales that emerges around this time in the 1990s is the idea of course, ending humanitarian crises, right, and mass atrocities. So in the 1990s, you have the 50th anniversary commemorations of the end of World War II and the Holocaust. You have the rise of a kind of Holocaust consciousness in the US, which has a lot to do with kind of various questions in sort of ethnic politics. And And yeah, so there's this broader sense of mass atrocity prevention as a potential rationale for American power, and the Bosnia crisis activates a lot of these concerns and debates, right? So the photograph that you see on the right from the Omarska concentration camp in northwest Bosnia, which was run by Serb nationalist forces, this was a camp where many thousands of people were murdered or subjected to human rights violations, and in kind of Western media audiences, the idea that mass atrocities could be happening against a population perceived as phenotypically white was seen as anomalous and interesting, right? So, if these had been kind of starving African bodies, right, I think the Western media audience would have shrugged and been like, that's sort of an everyday occurrence. But the idea of mass atrocities happening in Europe really kind of created this anxiety, right, in the sense of crisis of what does it mean to have a new world order? What does it mean to have Europe and a newly emergent European Union as a project of diversity and tolerance, right? So the concern over saving Bosnian Muslims was a major topic for kind of liberal audiences thinking about humanitarian intervention in the 1990s. The idea that, look, if Europe and the West can stand up and save the Bosnian Muslims, then this, shows that we've passed a test of our kind of tolerance and cosmopolitanness and so on. And underneath this was also the idea that the Bosnian Muslims are truly European Muslims, right? They don't necessarily practice, they drank, they lived under communism, they're not threatening as far as fundamentalism is concerned, right? So there's also this sort of odd cultural and racial politics in thinking about Islam at play. So I should also mention that the humanitarian intervention projects in Bosnia, of course, were extremely influential. The UN sent the largest ever peacekeeping force at the time, 40,000 strong. The UN created a war crimes tribunal that was the model for the later International Criminal Court. So all of this has been debated and written about pretty extensively. There's actually a huge literature on this. What has received far less attention is the fact that the Bosnia crisis also elicited enormous attention and sympathy among Muslim communities worldwide, right? So just as for the West, the idea of sort of white European Muslims was seen as sort of oxymoronic and interesting, the same was actually largely true in many parts of the Middle East and South Asia, right? So the idea of a white European Muslim population was also seen as proof of the transracial character of the global Muslim community, or Ummah. So the Bosnia crisis, sparked all sorts of solidaristic activity, right? Fundraising, sending humanitarian aid, protests, and so on. And also, there were also questions of suspicion, right? Like how practicing are the Bosnian Muslims, right? What is their relationship with Europeanness? So anyway, this idea of Bosnian Muslims as both European and Muslim, and the presumption that this is somehow a contradiction or a tension, is something that kind of weighed them down in these debates. So the book focuses on one very, very specific form of solidarity among Muslims worldwide in Bosnia, and that is travel and participation in combat. And I should stress that it's really only a small part of the broader picture of kind of Muslim solidarity with Bosnia, just as the Jihad mobilization is also a small part of the actual war effort and military situation on the ground. Yet, nevertheless, it's interesting as a case example of these so-called foreign fighter jihad mobilizations. So the how do I advance this slide? Great. So in the case of Bosnia, we're talking about a few thousand individuals traveling from various parts of the world, mostly Arab, but not entirely so. And they, as I mentioned, they're a pretty small part of the overall picture. But what's interesting is that they are, they're mostly gathered into a semi-autonomous unit under the command of the Army of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is nominally secular, multinational, and run by generals who are either not Muslim or not necessarily practicing Muslims. Yet the Jihad battalion itself is chooses its own leaders, raises its own funds from abroad, and largely adheres to Salafi orientations of Islam, and actually had a special training course that it required Bosnian recruits to pass, that largely taught kind of Salafi creed and texts as a condition for joining the unit. The unit was about half Bosnian and half foreign, as I mentioned, mostly Arab. And the book largely kind of traces the emergence and the fate of this jihad battalion. So in the upper left here, we have the symbol of the unit. It's called Katibat al-Mujahideen in Arabic, or Odr al-Mujahideen in Bosnian. And the motto is, our path is jihad, right? Which also is in both languages, Sabilillah al-Jihad and Nashput al-Jihad. On the upper right here, we have an image. These are both taken from kind of the publicity materials of the unit, right? So the flag here has the monotheistic creed of Islam emblazoned on it over a map of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So this is pretty standard kind of pan-Islamic imagery, for lack of a better term. Yet at the same time, as I mentioned, this unit was kind of integrated into the local context of the Bosnian army. So here in the lower right is a sort of seal and the signature of the unit's commander taken from one of its internal documents. And on the seal is this coat of arms. This is actually a Bosnian nationalist symbol. And then the text here indicates the postal code of the army unit within the Bosnian army. So this is actually a very standard kind of nationalist form of signification here. And then this gentleman here, I actually should have mentioned this photo first. This is kind of, your stereotypical image of the Arab foreign fighter who's seen as sort of geographically and racially out of place in the Bosnian context, right? So you've got these smiling blonde European children here on the left, and there's this larger trope that local Muslim populations, especially the Bosnians in Europe, are potentially tolerant and open, and can be disciplined into a kind of like secular project. And it's the rootless, geographically itinerant, fanatical Arab Salafis who are kind of imposing themselves into the picture, right? So that's kind of the this image sort of captures a lot of these tropes and assumptions that the book is kind of thinking with. So I should say a little bit more about the kind of framework for thinking in the book. So one of the main takeaways is that I think it's really important to get away from kind of a methodological nationalism, right? So oftentimes, in fact, the very idea of a foreign fighter presumes that the problem is foreignness, right? That if you go off and fight, quote unquote, in other people's wars, you are outside of kind of the nation state framework of violence. And that is, that's what's fundamentally troubling, right? Because for some reason that kind of violence is, can't be regulated or can't be understood well. And one thing that's sort of interesting about it is the way that it sort of imagines broader geographies, right? So for example, on the right here, this is a graphic from the Washington Post that shows the surge of foreign fighters to Syria, right? And kind of the typical approach that you'll see in a lot of the literature on the subject, again, is to work with a kind of a nation state framing. So you kind of make a list of all the countries that you think the fighters come from. You try to figure out how many come from each country, and then make a list of the variables that can somehow be correlated with this, which is an approach that I think has not yielded a ton of insight. One of the takeaways of the first half of the book is that it makes more sense to actually think about these mobilizations within deeper histories of imperial and diasporic circulation. So the time that I've spent with a lot of these jihad veterans made clear to me that a lot of them did not travel from their countries of origin to fight in jihad, right? So again, the stereotypical image of like, a Muslim gets radicalized in country A and then, suddenly jets off to country B to fight, misses out on a lot of things. A lot of the folks who fought in Bosnia were actually migrant workers who were already living in Europe and especially in Italy. And in many ways, the book traces the really complex trajectories of folks, right? So a lot of these people who travel are migrant workers, they're pilgrims, they're refugees, they're students, they're engaged in aid work, and they're engaged in fighting, and they're moving between these different categories across different points of their lives. On the left-hand side, so this image here well, I should back up a little bit. So this is a graveyard for a fallen mujahideen in Bosnia. This gentleman here, Ayman Awad, is a Syrian who fought in the war. So here we have these sort of so-called Salafi, burial stones for these jihad fighters. And here is a monument that they created for themselves. And the monument has a message here on the left that kind of conjures this idea of the global Muslim community, or ummah, kind of rising up as one to help their co-religionists. And if you zoom into the monument, you have this map here on the left, which again, with these arrows, kind of conjures this surge, right? This idea of Muslims coming from all over the world, which, as I mentioned, has a sort of eerie parallel with the kind of nation state security, imaginary that you see in this right-hand picture, right? And if you talk to these folks, a lot of them will say things like, yeah, I'd never heard of Bosnia before I decided to go. I didn't even know that there were Muslims in this place. But it's precisely through that ignorance and that discovery that one can demonstrate the strength of one's commitment to a kind of solidaristic project, right? Whereas the kind of outside perspective is something like, wow, these people go to fight in another country that they've never heard of before. They must be really crazy, right? So again, it's the nation state kind of assumption beneath both of these frameworks that renders this kind of travel either pathological or heroic. And the book is really trying to get away from both of those framings and say, well, actually, if you think about histories of migration, if you think about history as something that is on the move and not just confined within kind of nation state boxes, then you can appreciate a lot of things differently. So one way of doing that is to talk about this gentleman. He's also in that photo that I showed earlier, this one here. So this is Abu Abdulaziz. He was the leader of a small group of Arab mujahideen who came to Bosnia early in the war. And, he was a little bit of a publicity hound. He gave a ton of interviews. This photograph, the one in the center, appeared in Newsweek. On the left, you have an interview that he gave that appeared on the front page of Sharq al-Awsat newspaper, which is a major pan-Arab daily produced in London. On the right is an interview that he gave to Globus, which was a sort of Croatian magazine. So in a lot of these interviews, journalists asked Abu Abdulaziz, where is he from? And he would say something along the lines of, my nationality is Islam. But then later on in the interviews, it would kind of come out that he is a citizen of or he holds a passport from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So this kind of, again, lines up with a lot of the stereotypical expectations of foreign fighters, right? That he comes from a state that claims leadership over a global Muslim community through its wealth and through its custodianship of the two holy shrines, and that he's kind of a one-man vector of, Salafism, from the Arabian center of Islam to its, non-Middle Eastern peripheries. So, that's a pretty convenient narrative. When you actually dig into his history and talk to him, as I was able to do in Saudi Arabia several years ago, something much more interesting emerges. So that's Abu Abdulaziz on the right. On the left is his brother Khalid, who recently passed away. He was a very well-known family psychologist and kind of like a sex therapist, basically, in Saudi Arabia. He gave a lot of sort of advice on domestic relations and things. So Abu Abdulaziz, yes, he holds a Saudi passport. But what's more interesting is that he was born in 1940 in the princely state of Hyderabad in southern India. And his family migrated from the Hadramaut region of Yemen in the early 20th century. So Abu Abdulaziz grew up in a sort of Arabian diasporic world in South Asia. And Hyderabad's interesting because it was the largest and most powerful of the nominally independent princely states in the Indian subcontinent. And Hadrami Arabs from Yemen played a very prominent role in the police and army forces of Hyderabad. And actually in 1948, when India conquered Hyderabad, the head of the Hyderabadi army who surrendered to them was himself a Hadrami general. Abu Abdulaziz grew up speaking Urdu, Arabic, and English equally well, and his family migrated to the Hejaz in Saudi Arabia in around 1950. So they were able to get Saudi citizenship and, were part of this broader sort of Hadrami, Hyderabadi diasporic world in Jeddah. He grew up, he got a job as a clerk for Saudi Airways. a job that enabled him to continue sort of traveling the world. Around middle age in the 1980s, he joined the Jihad in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, spent one night at the front, was not a particularly prominent player. But around this time, with the early retirement that you get kind of in the Saudi bureaucracy, he had time, disposable income, and relative youth. So he goes to Bosnia. And in a way, it's not a coincidence that someone of his kind of cosmopolitan background and sort of cultural repertoires, and being used to speaking different languages and operating different contexts, it's not entirely surprising that someone like him would have been one of the first people on the ground in Bosnia. And I should mention that the diaspora that he's part of, the Hadrami diaspora, has a very, very long history across the entire Indian Ocean. So you have Hadrami communities everywhere from East Africa to Singapore that have always sort of found ways to interact with local populations. And as we see in the work of Aung San Ho, my doctoral advisor, has also played a role in kind of anti-colonial mobilizations of a transnational nature in different historical contexts. So anyway, the first chapter of the book really kind of reconstructs some of these migrations and tries to help us understand these fighters outside of a kind of nation state framework. The rest of the first part of the book tries to understand how different kinds of difference were worked out, right? So you have these jihad fighters who arrive in the name of, a global Muslim community, but they have to contend with actual forms of national, racial, doctrinal difference. And so there's all sorts of, tensions and fallings out that come out of that. They have to navigate their relationship with the Bosnian Islamic clerics, the ulama. There's a whole chapter that deals with the Bosnians who joined this unit and kind of their own journeys. One of the interesting areas where different notions of Islamic law and practice emerge is in the question of burials, right? So this is a photograph of another cemetery, and you see that there's this difference in burial styles between these shorter kind of Salafi headstones that are supposed to be unmarked, and the upright grave markers that are consistent with the Hanafi school of Islamic law, and which are much more common in the Bosnian context. And in questions about how people should be buried, and debates between the jihad fighters and also local family members, right, around all of these questions of practice and debates over what it means and who can speak kind of in the name of Islam. Another major theme, of course, is marriage. So some of the fighters who came during the war married Bosnian women. So there's very interesting questions here about kind of the racialization of desire as well. The idea of, Bosnian women as white and as seen as desirable, as well as the perception of Arabs as representing a more kind of authentic Islam. And in the case of Arabs coming from the Gulf, having access to considerable wealth. Now, of course, that wasn't always the case, and the marriages kind of work out in all sorts of different ways. This is a particularly interesting case here. The photograph on the left, that's on the upper left corner here, Abu Hamza Suri is again a veteran of the jihad, and his wife, Zine Softic here, she's obviously Bosnian and was married to a Bosnian imam who was murdered in the Omarska concentration camp, the camp that what I showed you a photo of earlier on. So they had 3 children from that marriage. And then when she married Abu Hamza, they had 3 more children. So the book goes into some detail about the creation of these new kind of multiracial and multicultural families in the context of the jihad. Here on the right is a photograph of Abu Hamza and his Bosnian brother-in-law, who has lived in Switzerland since the war. So there's all these interesting questions of who counts as a representative of so-called foreign forms of Islam in the Bosnian context, and various sort of navigations that come out of that. The second half of the book kind of pivots, right? So if the first half tries to help us understand the jihad in Bosnia, not so much as like a security threat, but as a kind of universalist project on its own, where there's a message that's being directed at all of humanity, but that requires its own ways of navigating difference. That, to me, as someone kind of coming out of a human rights NGO background, is not unfamiliar, right? So human rights movements, humanitarian movements, NGOs are engaged in a structurally similar set of debates and challenges, right? So it's, obviously the people who came to Bosnia and fought, they represented, or they had the active sympathy and interest of very small part of the population. But that's no less true of like any number of humanitarian intervention projects as well. So I want to be very clear that when I talk about a universalist project, I'm not saying that there's anything actually universal about what people are talking about, right? It's about the nature of the aspiration. So you can have a universalist project, you know, that maybe only 200 people are, you know, engaged in, but it can still be kind of ethnographically interesting. Anyway, so the second half of the book tries to use the lens that was crafted in the first half to better understand larger universalisms that that folks tend to be a little bit more familiar with, right? So one of them is, of course, the socialist non-aligned movement that attempted to carve a middle path between the capitalist West and the communist East during the Cold War. And this is interesting because Yugoslavia was a major player in the non-aligned movement. And in that context, one of the ways in which racial diversity was experienced by people in Yugoslavia before the war was in the presence of students from you know, Africa and Asia who came to study, you know, under the banner of kind of anti-colonial solidarity, which included a large number of Arabs. You have Arabs coming from places like Syria and Iraq, you know, the more kind of left-leaning or socialist-leaning states, who in the as Yugoslavia falls apart and as the communist project there is discredited, and as people start to identify through nationalist labels like Serb and Croat and Bosniak first, the foreign nationals become racialized in a different way. So Arabs in Yugoslavia go from being seen as like mascots of anti-colonial solidarity to being seen as symbols of a kind of Islamist threat. Right. So you have all of these folks, quite ironically, most of them are themselves like either secular or atheist, but being subjected to all kinds of like racial profiling at checkpoints, right? Simply because of their Arabness. That being said, a small number of them do end up joining the jihad. And what's interesting here is that when the jihad fighters arrive in Bosnia, you know, especially from, you know, who speak Arabic, they come from the Middle East, they, of course, need people to act as translators and guides in the local context. So it's the Arab students who are already there, who are bilingual, who play this really, really important kind of linking role. So there's kind of an interesting historical irony here, where some of the individuals who arrived in Yugoslavia as an embodiment of kind of socialist solidarity then end up playing this role, kind of enabling pan-Islamist solidarity instead. So anyway, this newspaper clipping here, these are 4 Arab aid workers who were arrested at the end of the war and then accused of being, you know, sort of covert mujahideen. And of course, the charges against them were eventually dropped and they were able to successfully sue and get compensation for it. There's another chapter on UN peacekeeping. So as I mentioned, the largest ever UN peacekeeping force was in Bosnia, and frequently overlooked is the fact that it was basically a third Muslim itself. So if you want to talk about foreign Muslim soldiers in the Bosnian War, it's the UN peacekeepers who vastly outnumber the jihad fighters. And the book kind of shows how a lot of these peacekeeping operations rely on institutional structures and histories of imperial soldiering that were set up during high colonialism, which is also why India and Pakistan in particular play a disproportionate role in UN peacekeeping operations. So in the photograph here, this is a monument to Pakistani peacekeepers in the city of Tuzla. And what's interesting about these folks is that, you know, they see themselves as participating in solidarity with fellow Muslims in Bosnia, but at the same time as good, upstanding members of the international community who, you know, are part of a UN operation, who are fulfilling kind of, you know, quote unquote, professional standards of impartiality and so on. So for them, there isn't any kind of inherent contradiction, which is also important to keep in mind, because when I talk about, you know, these jihads as universalist projects, I'm not trying to rehash a kind of like Samuel Huntington kind of, you know, argument about civilizations, right? So the argument here is not that Islam is a universalism and the West is a different universalism, right? It's that people are engaged in universalist projects all the time, but they draw from and cobble together their efforts from a whole variety of sort of repertoires that are available to them, right? So there can be many different universalist projects that speak in an Islamic idiom, and you can have universalist projects that attempt to combine Islamic and liberal idioms all at the same time. And just to push the point further, here, this is Abdul Manaf Kusmuri. He's a really interesting figure. He's a Malaysian former army officer, graduate of Sandhurst, spent many years fighting communist guerrillas in the jungles of Malaysia. During the Bosnian War, he volunteers with the UN, goes to Bosnia, and is basically fed up by what he sees. You know, he's fed up with the incompetence or the complicity of the UN in mass atrocities against Muslims. So he quits and he joins the Jihad. But because of his military background, he goes on to plan a lot of the major operations that the Jihad battalion is engaged with. And, you know, so I caught up with him in Kuala Lumpur a couple of years ago. And again, for him, there isn't any kind of deep contradiction or cognitive dissonance in his move from the UN to the Jihad battalion, right? In both instances, you know, there was this intention to act in solidarity with Muslims in Bosnia, and he was looking for kind of the best path to get there, and moved from one kind of, you know, multinational military formation to a different multinational military formation. The last chapter gets to the war on terror. So of course, in the 1990s moment before 9/11, so, you know, just for people who may not be familiar with the history, in the 80s, the US is actively supporting jihad in Afghanistan and isn't directly sort of behind the foreign fighters who go to Afghanistan, but clearly doesn't have a problem with them, right? People like Osama bin Laden and so on. After 9/11, these folks are totally, you know, criminalized and they're seen as kind of a threat to humanity. The 90s moment is interesting. It's in between with Bosnia, right? The US isn't particularly, you know, enthusiastic or supportive of the jihad fighters who go, but they're not totally antagonistic to them either. Although when the US finally sends troops to Bosnia at the end of the war as part of a peacekeeping settlement, they do force the Bosnian government to kick these guys out. So most of them leave. A small number marry Bosnian women and settle, get citizenship, stay in the country, basically become civilians. And after 9/11, they are targeted for imprisonment as part of the global war on terror. So on the left-hand side, this is a photograph of Ahmed Zohair. He was my client in Guantanamo because I spent a few years as part of a legal clinic sort of defending detainees down there. And that experience is not written about in the book because a lot of the information is classified, but the experience certainly informed a lot of the ways that I thought about and approached this issue. On the right-hand side, there's a map of various detention sites that are part of the global war on terror. And these include, you know, the well-known sites like, you know, Guantanamo as a prison that's run directly by the US, but it also includes everyday prisons and sites of detention that are run by client states of the US. So one of the really important points that I want to stress about the last chapter of the book is that much of the violence of US empire and of the global war on terror isn't carried out directly by the US. It's usually carried out by other states kind of doing the dirty work of the US. So the last chapter focuses a lot on sort of ethnography that I conducted in a newly built immigration detention center in Bosnia on the outskirts of Sarajevo. And essentially what happened was that in order to join the European Union and to be considered civilized enough to be part of Europe, the United States and the European Union told Bosnia that they needed to create an immigration detention regime and gave them millions of dollars to build an immigration prison, set up a special, you know, Bosnian version of ICE. And what was particularly interesting was that the first people who were put in the detention center weren't migrants who were caught crossing the border. They were Arabs, primarily veterans of the jihad, who had already been living in the country for, say, 10, 15, 20 years, had Bosnian families, spoke Bosnian fluently. But because they were deemed suspicious for having participated in the jihad in the 90s, they were targeted in the war on terror. The best known case were 6 Algerians who were sent to Guantanamo in 2002 from Bosnia without any evidence. And one of those folks is the eponymous plaintiff in the landmark US Supreme Court case, Boumediene v. Bush, which led to habeas corpus rights being recognized for folks in Guantanamo. But for the other folks who were held in this immigration prison, basically the idea was that the US put pressure on Bosnia to strip them of their Bosnian citizenship and deport them to their countries of origin, where they would presumably face the risk of imprisonment and torture. So Abu Hamza, whose picture I showed you earlier with his family, he spent 7 years in the immigration detention center without charge on the basis of secret evidence labeled a threat to national security. So, he's also a bit cheeky, right? So you can see from his, fashion here, the kinds of symbols that he's trying to evoke in terms of, making very clear the connection between this ordinary Bosnian detention center and the kind of broader structures in the global war on terror. So the idea here in thinking about questions of universalism is that, it's not simply the case that I think we're familiar with this argument that, the war on terror is basically a war on Islam. And I think there's obviously a lot of truth to that. But what often gets overlooked is that the, universalist projects are also about the right to speak in the name of the universal and to make decisions on behalf of other people about what kinds of differences count as acceptable and what kinds of differences are seen as threatening. So the language that the US used in Bosnia was not an anti-Muslim language in itself. It was a language that was more like Bosnian Muslims have their own national and tolerant form of Islam, and they need to be protected from these kind of foreign, crazy Salafi fighters, right? So one of the top US officials in Bosnia literally told the Washington Post, these people, by which he means like Arabs, like Abu Hamza, they look alien, they talk alien, they act alien. Bosnian Muslims have their own way of doing things, and these people don't fit in. So in this way of thinking of things, the US actually sets itself up as the guardian of Muslim plurality, right? Like saving Muslims, good Muslims from, of course, the sort of more fundamentalist, unrooted Muslims that can't be easily understood or controlled in kind of a nation state framework. So the response of these guys in detention is to flip the script, right? Is to say, look, don't look at us as foreign Muslims, rather, don't look at us as foreign Arabs, rather look at us as fellow Muslims, right? So they're kind of calling on this idea that, during the time of the war, we acted in the name of solidarity with you and came and participated in the fighting. And, why is it that you're kind of like selling us out to the US kind of in the post 9/11 moment? So anyway, the last chapter kind of gets into these debates and the way that the arguments around solidarity and national difference kind of get invoked and sort of moved around in these contexts. So I think I'll just stop there so that we can have more time for Q&A and discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. That was impressive. Who would like to get first? We have about half an hour for questions, and we would like to start with really anyone who would like to start.
I could start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jay. I am a senior at George Mason University. I'm majoring in cultural anthropology and currently serving as Dr. Ipek's Middle Eastern class as a TA. My question for you was that your topic on global war on terror is so fascinating, and I was wondering, where did you draw your initial inspiration from to even actually research in Bosnia area and Muslim population?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, what's funny about your question is that, when I was kind of getting started in grad school, this was an extremely hot topic, right? So I think there were a lot of people who were doing research on the global war on terror. Not to say that, that a lot of good stuff came out of it, but I think in my own sense, I was originally interested in the Arabs who fought in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And the idea there was basically to get a better sense of the backstory of Al-Qaeda, because the standard narrative was kind of just, a bunch of crazy Arabs went and fought the Soviets, and then they did 9/11. And there, was a much broader and more interesting range of mobilizations at work, people going with all sorts of different agendas. And in the early 1990s, even Osama bin Laden wasn't the Osama bin Laden who, the world came to know later on, right, a decade later. So I spent a few months doing fieldwork in Pakistan, and I had a really good time, gathered a lot of really interesting material, but also realized that the kind of project that I wanted to do was just not really feasible, because a lot of the people I wanted to talk to were essentially on the run. So it was at that time that I heard about a group of similar folks, sort of Arab jihad veterans who were living in Bosnia. And Bosnia just, is much like there wasn't a war going on at the time, right? They were much more accessible. So I shifted the focus of my research to Bosnia. But what started out as kind of like an opportunistic move for methodological reasons also turned out to be really helpful for thinking about the bigger theoretical questions behind the project, because Bosnia had been like such a key site for thinking about humanitarian intervention in the 1990s. So that ended up being pretty fortuitous. And also because the jihad fighters in Bosnia were partially integrated into a state structure, unlike in a lot of other places, like in Afghanistan, there's a much richer archival paper trail that they left behind. So I was able to, get access to a lot of internal records and reconstruct a lot of their debates in ways that I think are a lot more difficult than some of these other settings.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful.
Thank you so much. Dr. Abbas Barzagar wanted to ask a question. Dr. Barzagar.
Hi there. Thank you to the Ox Center, and thank you to Darryl for doing this great work and being with us. I came across, I think I came across a podcast you did. Maybe it was with the Ottoman. I think it was the Ottoman. There's like an Ottoman podcast or something. Anyway, I really enjoyed the book. I ordered it, and one of the areas that's really interesting to me is the blurred lines that you talk about between humanitarian aid workers and people that are here to participate in the jihad. And I came across similar blurred lines in working with sort of refugee aid organizations in in Turkey, that were sort of, going back and forth into Syria on a daily basis. And so you say here, that there's a line that I want to read that I'd love for you to expound upon and kind of just hear more about. And you say that the ambiguity is not merely reducible to anti-Muslim paranoia on the one hand and operational realities of clandestine armed work on the other. What ties these activities together is how they are commonly understood as driven by values, religious, ideological, and ethical. And I'd really, love to hear you move more in that direction, or hear your thoughts on sort of jihad as an ethical obligation, and how it really isn't in the minds of these actors different than humanitarian work. And so love to hear more about that if possible.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, as a lawyer, like, litigating the Guantanamo cases, you often have the situation where, a person goes in front of a judge and the defense lawyer is like, oh, they were there to teach Quran or to do aid work. And the government's like, oh, no, they were, terrorist operatives, right? So this question of, is someone an altruist or a terrorist, right, keeps on coming up again and again in the war on terror litigation. And so I kind of had that debate in the back of my head and sort of saying, look, it's just the case that when we're talking about solidarity activities, people are going to move between different ways of being supportive. Most people who go, whether we're talking about, Syria or Bosnia, they go with some vague idea of wanting to help. And then the specific means of fighting or aid work or whatever is usually just kind of a secondary question. And this is not at all limited to kind of pan-Islamic organizing contexts, right? If you look at the history of leftist mobilizations, you also see that kind of, blurriness, if you will. And also there's also a very significant literature on the intersection between private military contracting and humanitarian aid work. Right. So even among the so-called like secular liberal formations, right, like, you have like, there's an entire literature that's like, trying to analyze what does it mean when Blackwater, is one day, protecting a US military base and the other day going out and like escorting, some humanitarian aid convoy somewhere. So in that sense, I think it's really important to recognize that this issue of aid work and fighting often kind of getting mixed up is not at all kind of like a uniquely kind of like Muslim issue.
Oh, no, thank you for that. Actually, if you don't mind, I'll just follow up with a couple of notes that have been sort of lurking in my mind. Is that the Obama administration got jammed up there for a minute because they were funneling non-lethal aid to FSA fighters through US nonprofits. And that was a kind of interesting formation. And then I've always been very suspicious of the fetish with Muslim humanitarian organizations that came post-Afghanistan, because the United States was also working with transnational Muslim networks to send, resources to the frontier to fund the jihad outside of like the direct lethal aid. But there was, everything from, food caravans to clothing, they were very much operative on that side as well. So it seems to me that the security apparatus is very well aware of this because they helped build it and they participated in it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, what I would say is that, yeah, everyone understands that aid work and military work is deeply connected. And yes, for anyone to, sanctimoniously be like, oh, these people are like, polluting the purity of aid work with this organizing. I mean, that's not really a tenable position. But the other takeaway is that, yeah, transnational Islamist networks can serve any number of different agendas, right? So a lot of the literature that I was kind of thinking about and writing against when I started the project was one that sort of, kind of treated the national framework as like potentially good or potentially redeemable, and then just took all of the transnational stuff and kind of put it into the same bucket of, ungrounded, unmoored, unaccountable, and essentially crazy, right? But when you actually look at what's going on, you just see that, yeah, transnational networks can be used for any variety of agendas, just as local networks can be, right? So in that sense, there isn't like any kind of inherent difference. And what we want to do is just get a better sense of what's going on, who's doing these things, and what are the different sorts of competing goals at work, right? So for example, Iran and Turkey, also very involved in the Bosnian War. Hezbollah was there. They've actually acknowledged losing 2 martyrs in the Bosnian War. And there's stories of like, tensions between them and the people who I write about, who are of course like not, of the sort of Hezbollah orientation.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you.
I don't see any hands raised, so I'm going to go ahead and read the question in the chat box by Noma Nabi. During the war in Bosnia, you mentioned secular Bosnians fought along the foreign jihadis. Does your research mention religious influence on the secular Bosnians?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is yes, and that's really what the second chapter is about. Separate from these guys coming and fighting, there's a relatively small number of devout Bosnian Muslims who decide at the beginning of the war that they want to create their own military where Islamic religious practice will be prioritized, right? So for the vast majority of Muslims in Bosnia, think of themselves as Muslim in a kind of like national sense, right? It's a national category, and practice is, they might practice, but they might not, right? So these people created this smaller, segment of the population had their own kind of religious militias, if you will, and they were the main kind of interlocutors with the jihad fighters who came. But the thing that's funny is that a lot of the religious Bosnian Muslims were also Naqshbandi Sufis. So, for those who might be familiar with this context, there's kind of this trope of Sufis and Salafis kind of always being in competition or being in conflict. But in the Bosnian case, the Salafi fighters who came from abroad and the Bosnian Sufis, they did have tensions, but they also had a lot more in common with each other than with the broader population, which was not practicing at all, right? So what ends up happening is there is essentially one religious Islamic unit in the Bosnian army that is run by the Bosnian Sufis. And then you have this battalion that I'm talking about, which is religious, but of a Salafi orientation. And as I mentioned, is half Bosnian and half foreign. And it does engage in proselytizing among the broader Bosnian army. So towards the end of the war, they are placed, they're given responsibility for a series of offensives in Northeast Bosnia. So that first cemetery that I showed you is from that part of Bosnia. And they were allowed to proselytize, to do da'wah, among other Bosnian army units. And of course, there was a lot of tension and a lot of pushback from secular folks who were not not interested in what they were selling. But there were also a fair number of people who were interested and who joined. So a lot of the Bosnians who were in the Jihad battalion had actually deserted other army units. And then you have people who are in between, who were secular, but who, kind of respected the Jihad battalion and these folks for, showing up from abroad and for their participation in military sort of, operations, right? So you have a whole interesting range of responses among people in the Bosnian army of all sorts of different, religious practice orientations.
I see Marcia Hermanson.
Yeah, thank you very much for organizing this. It was amazing. And thank you, Darryl. And it was really stimulating. So I'm wondering, you've been thinking about this a lot. And I have an issue when I'm teaching my intro to Islam, and I'm right there now talking about contemporary types of Islamic thought. Mm-hmm. And back in the day, it was all, Hamilton Gibbs, Mohammedanism, and we talked about nationalism and pan-Islamism. And the example, pan-Islamism, Jamaluddin Afghani, nationalism, Ataturk, and Reza Khan Pahlavi. And I'm thinking what you just presented kind of breathed life into that tension between nationalism and pan-Islamism. And I'd like your insights in how to bring that into the class. Like this is really complicated. And also there's not like this, I'm feeling like there isn't the corpus of, what Jamaluddin Afghani thought or what Ataturk did. But I feel that there's a way to get it, like what's the deal with nationalism and pan-Islamism 100 years plus down the road? That's my question.
Yeah, great. That's exactly the kind of like problem space or discussions that, that I want the book to kind of get inserted into. I think what I would say is that, part of the challenge is that we want to think about pan-Islamism as like an actual set of, practical projects that people get into, and to move away from sort of like a big man theory of history, right? And there's a lot of scholars who have been doing this in a more historical vein. All the folks working on sort of like Muslim mobility. So I'm thinking of like Mana Kia's recent book, or even Sima Alavi's book. But in the more recent period, that has been more challenging. And I think there's a lot of like historical brush clearing that still needs to happen. There's a really interesting historian called Timothy Noonan who's beginning to do some of this work. He looks at kind of the relationship between left and Islamist internationalisms in the 1970s. So that, I don't know when that's going to come out, but I think that will be particularly interesting. But basically, I think also we want to be clear that pan-Islamism doesn't have like necessary content attached to it, right? And you can have really, really different notions of what that's supposed to mean, many of which are also compatible with and presuppose the nation state in some way, right? So just as, when I think of like liberal universalist projects like human rights, they also are not trying to like get rid of the nation state, right? Because every universalist project still needs some kind of like, body that incarnates those ideas and carries them out. And the nation state is one potential way of doing that, right? Whether we're talking about left projects, Islamic projects, liberal projects, or whatever. But at the same time, what a universalism is trying to do is to like set up a framework to, in which the nation state can be kind of like placed, right? To have criteria for saying, okay, when the nation state does this, it's good. When it doesn't, it's bad, right? So, so I think also just to get away from this idea that like pan-Islamic projects are about kind of just erasing all the borders, right? And having everyone kind of just be in one like giant, sort of, amorphous space. There certainly are pan-Islamic projects that advocate for the abolition of the nation state form. But I think once you start looking at the more practical manifestations of these things, you find that like it's really hard for them to totally escape the logic of nationalism.
Thank you so much. I see Mohammed El Sayed Bushra raising hand, and then Abbas Barzagar wants to ask a second question.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Mohammed Bushra. I'm a PhD student at Georgetown University, and I've been a fan of your work for quite a number of years. So kind of following up from the previous question, what I'm interested in is when you look at a lot of militant jihadi groups, the kind of typical narrative which we see, and I think there is probably some truth to it, is when it started out, let's say in Afghanistan, there was this idea to an extent of limiting activity to a particular domain. So Afghanistan, once you come into the 90s, Chechnya, Bosnia, and so on and so forth, Eritrea. And what was novel in the case of Al-Qaeda in the 90s going forward was this internationalism or pan-Islamism, or whatever you want to call it, kind of wanting to, at least in terms of ideas, do away with this idea of borders. And they were kind of very, they would front the fact that, let's say, many of the leaders are coming from different parts of the world and so on, and operating on an international scale as well. However, what we see more recently is, maybe in the last decade or so, or even 20 years, is kind of a gradual move back, even among these groups, towards acting within specific spheres. So what I think the first striking example to me was when Al-Qaeda in Iraq rebranded as Majlis Shura al-Mujahideen prior to becoming ISIS. They made a point of, obviously, I think it seems under the pressure of all of these accusations, you're foreign fighters, to rebrand the entire leadership as, no, look, they're all Iraqis, right? And then the same happens in Syria, the same happens in all of these different places. So even groups which are kind of engaged in this kind of internationalization, taking a step back. So I just maybe wanted to hear your comments on this. Like, is it literally just something that's happening under the pressure of, accusations of being foreign fighters and all of these kinds of pressures? Is it just practicality, or is it something else? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, it's, the short answer is it's a combination of all of those things, I think. But also I want, so I think in all of the different stages that you're talking about, there is internationalism in the sense that you've got people coming from all different places, joining up, and and that is part of what's lauded about these groups, right? Oh, mashallah, we have people coming from all these different countries. What's different about Al-Qaeda is that, the locus of the fighting is not territorialized, right? So, okay, we'll hit the US in Yemen, we'll hit them in Tanzania, whatever, right? But, whether we're talking about the Afghan Jihad in the 80s, the Al-Qaeda project in the 2000s, or say ISIS or the Bosnian Jihad, they still celebrate kind of the internationalism of the composition of the people who are coming in fighting, right? And so again, that's why I also, again, just to come back to this point of, we want to pull apart and disaggregate this category of, what we mean when we talk about transnational or international, right? And that there's just different ways of doing it. Now, more specifically in response to your question, I think, even, on the eve of 9/11, Al-Qaeda was, yes, on the one hand, it was claiming to wage a war against the US around the world. But at the same time, it was also, deeply enmeshed in the state consolidation projects of the Taliban, right? So there's always kind of like some gesture to a territorial project, right? Mostly for practical reasons. It's just easier to do these things if you have some like immediate safety around you. The immediate aftermath of the invasion, right? That's where I think you have like the closest thing to deterritorialization, right? So the Al-Qaeda people flee, and then you have this whole argument about like franchising and is Al-Qaeda an organization versus a brand, and then the idea is, so that notion of fragmentation is there and it exists. But I think when that happens, it's precisely at that moment that they lose a lot of control over what they're doing. And getting back to some kind of territorial basis is always appealing for that reason, right? It's like the classic debate, I think, like the debate between like Dawla and Jabhat, like between ISIS and like Al-Qaeda types, right? It's sort of, the folks who say, look, you need something like a state in order to get anything done, right? Like, you need some sort of territorial control. You need to be able to, create some space to do things, right? Like Al-Qaeda had in Afghanistan before 9/11, training camps and things like that. But the response to that from the other side, from the more kind of like state skeptical side of people is, look, if you want territorial control, you also have to like run schools, take out the garbage, fix the electricity bills, and you've also painted a giant target on your back, because it's much easier for the US to come in and basically kick your ass if you are emulating a territorial entity and running a state. So what you really should be doing is kind of be on the run and be dispersed and live in caves like us, right? And then of course, from the other side, ISIS people are like, you live in caves, you're not getting anything done. You have no popular base and you basically exist on the internet, right? So I think this, this ongoing set of debates, right, between the territorial and the deterritorial approaches captures a lot of this ambiguity that sort of gets back to Marsha's question about what's the role of the nation state, right? On the one hand, we agree that we can't limit things to the nation state. We want to be transnational, we want to be solidaristic, but we also don't want to like give up all of the benefits that a nation state or an organization like the nation state can provide us in terms of, resources, security, organizational space, and so on.
Thank you so much. Dr. Abbas Barzagar has been waiting for quite a while.
No, we're okay. I want to be mindful of time. I don't know exactly, I want to be mindful of time, and thank you again. Two things quickly, Darryl, on the question of sort of universalism in the 1970s and that pan-Islamism, I would invite you to look at the AVACGIS Center's project. It's called aftermalcolm.com. This is a digital archive that we created of Black Muslim movements in the 70s. And we have some newspapers there that I think you would find very interesting. We have excerpts from Maududi and Qutb and, kind of this interpollination. And so it's very nice to see. It's something I'd love to get your feedback on. But the question is, I read a little bit about your position vis-a-vis DevG in the book, but I'd like to hear more. So how do you see your work contrasting with Faisal DevG's sort of treatment of Mujahideen as kind of humanitarians and whatnot, and think how it contrasts and overlaps with that sort of perspective?
Yeah. So for those who are interested, Faisal wrote a review of my book. TLDR, he's not a fan. And, basically, I think, okay, so I'm going to assume people have not read his books or not necessarily familiar with his argument. But Faisal Devji, also makes this, he has a book called The Terrorist in Search of Humanity, and also draws this comparison, right, between groups like Al-Qaeda and humanitarian groups. I obviously think the comparison is interesting and can be productive. Where I disagree is that he seems to feel like all forms of transnational or non-national organization are classified for him as like globalizing and lose any kind of like solidity or grounding or rationality. So to me, I feel like he doesn't really, take movements, whether we're talking about secular humanitarian movements or, these sort of jihad mobilizations, I feel like he doesn't really take them seriously. And he treats them sort of as like, residual pathologies of globalization. And, I think there's a lot to be criticized about these groups. And I think the criticisms that they, lack accountability and that they lack grounding in popular movements are absolutely, worthy of consideration. But I don't go quite as far as sort of just, thinking of them as pathological. So for me, actually capturing, their political logics and their antagonisms is important, and that requires really difficult empirical research. It requires, going out and talking to people and recovering their archival record. And so, yeah, there's also kind of like a commitment to empirical work that I think is really important, and that I think he tends to feel like is, not important or not necessary.
Dr. Lee, if you don't mind, we have around 5 minutes left. May I read the two questions on the chat box? Would that be okay?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Together. So the first is from the student Sana Khan. From the readings, I got the feel that the individuals you spoke with as veterans of jihad in Bosnia, they are different, but they are not entirely different from other people in Bosnia and compared to similar movements in other pieces. It's not a completely exceptional case, right? I think you have briefly addressed this already, but I was curious to know more about the diversity within those groups. And I was hoping you could elaborate on how their perspectives on different universalisms compare. And sorry, this is a little long. And the other question is from Rakia Samim. My question is that, did you experience a limitation to your study that you did not assume would be a limitation? Something that made you take a step back? Thank you.
Great. Thank you for those questions. Sana, I'm not sure which groups you're talking about here. Yasemin, do you have a sense of what this is referring to?
Sana, would you like to unmute yourself and clarify your question?
Yeah, so it's basically just the group in Bosnia itself, like the diversity within them.
You mean the Jihad battalion that I'm...
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So, okay. There's, so you're right that it's not exceptional, right? That many of these transnational jihad mobilizations are bringing together people from different places. And so in the book, I get into a lot of the tensions, right? Say between like the Arabs and the non-Arabs, right? Or between the Bosnians and the foreigners. Also issues around language, right? So at first, the first few years, access to Bosnia was very difficult because of a siege. So when the Jihad battalion was relatively small, you had a lot more kind of forced kind of cultural and linguistic mixing. So a lot of the folks who were there in that time learned Bosnian quite well. In the last year of the war, it was much easier to come. And you had a lot of people who participated in the jihad kind of like on a seasonal basis, especially coming from the Gulf, who would come for like a vacation, essentially, a month, 6 weeks, and then leave. So when the unit was larger, you had a lot more sort of segregation along linguistic lines, right? So like, units where everyone spoke Arabic, units where people spoke English, units where people kind of spoke like a patois, like a mixing of these different languages. But there's a pretty consistent idea that the diversity itself of the national and cultural forms is something that's impressive, right? And is evidence of the jihad's kind of like, righteousness, for lack of a better term. Rakia, for your question, is there, it's funny, I actually had the opposite experience. I had limitations. I had things that I thought were limitations and that turned out not to be limitations. And the most important of those was my background kind of in the human rights NGO world and my legal training. I kind of went into the research thinking that that would make me kind of an object of suspicion. And I downplayed a lot of that stuff. And when I started doing the research and trying to approach these guys, I was just like, oh, I'm an academic researcher. And, they basically had no reason to talk to me, right? These are folks who were afraid of, being arrested and deported. And, they were just like, what are you doing here? So it took me a while to build these relationships of trust. And part of how I was able to do that was to leverage the background that I had as a potentially useful resource, right? So the fact that I had familiarity with and could speak kind of the language of sort of these international human rights NGOs was something that was actually helpful to them as they were kind of strategizing how to, fight these efforts to have them denationalized and deported. So the introduction of the book, I talk a little bit more about the legal practice that I did in connection with the research, and how I also was doing it in a way so as to be helpful, but at the same time maintain some critical distance, right? So I wasn't their lawyer. I didn't represent them, right? Because I think that would raise a whole bunch of other kind of ethical questions, right? But I tried to find ways to use the resources in my background to be helpful, in that specific context. Yeah, while at the same time, preserving some distance so that we could, have some more critical conversations.
I don't see any other questions. Maybe we can read Jay's clarification question. Jay has been asking, again, if there's no any other comment or question. Let's see. Could you elaborate more on jihad as religious category versus social definition of jihad as a social phenomenon?
So I know we're almost out of time, so I'll just try to be really brief. People, believers have all sorts of debates about what counts as jihad or not, right? And those debates are extremely rich and complex. And, there's people who have a really, really specific idea of fighting and say that's the only jihad. There's other people who are like, waking up in the morning and taking care of your kids is jihad, right? So, I don't want to, I think the problem is that, as a social scientific category, when folks talk about jihadism, right, what they're essentially doing is choosing some of these things that Muslims call jihad and making that the basis for like a social scientific category and writing books about it and having conferences and building think tanks, and doing that without really any justification that I can identify, right? So that for me is why I'm very suspicious of jihadism as kind of an analytical category, right? Like I think the general sense is that it's non-state violence by Muslims that liberals don't like. But that, that takes out a huge portion, even of like organized political violence called jihad, right? Like when Iran and Iraq fought a war in the 80s, both sides called it jihad at various points, right? Like that isn't even like considered most of the time when we talk about jihadism as a category. So yeah, I mean, that's my kind of short answer to that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Thank you everyone for coming. This has been really a pleasant experience and I enjoyed both the talk and the Q&A. Please contact us. Please follow the Vural Center events and thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much for your questions, everyone, and for your time.